Kappa. Please pronounce it as Kappa. Ryuunosuke Akutagawa. Here are some excerpts from the story. I sat down on a rock by the water's edge and started to eat. I cut the cans of corned beef, gathered dried branches, and started a fire. About 10 minutes had passed while I was doing these things. Meanwhile, the endless, nasty fog had gradually cleared. As I nibbled at my bread, I glanced at my watch. It was already 20 minutes past midnight. But what surprised me more than anything was that a shadow of a creepy face was cast on the round glass of my watch. I turned around in surprise. And then, it was the first time I had ever seen a kappa. On the rock behind me was a kappa, just like in the picture, holding a birch trunk in one hand and holding the other over its eyes, looking down at me curiously. I was stunned and didn't move for a while. The kappa seemed to be surprised as well, and didn't even move his hands over his eyes. Before long, I took off and jumped at the kappa on the rock. At the same time, the kappa ran away again. Or rather, it probably did. In fact, it dodged me with a swipe and disappeared somewhere in an instant. Even more surprised, I looked around in the bamboo grass. The kappa then fled, looking back at me from a distance of a few meters. That was nothing strange. But what surprised me was the color of the kappa's body. The kappa that had been watching me from the rock was completely gray. But now its whole body had turned green. I yelled, "Damn it," and jumped at the kappa again. Of course, the kappa ran away. For the next 30 minutes or so, I ran through the Japanese bamboo grass, jumped over rocks, and continued to pursue the kappa with all my might. Kappas are no less fast than monkeys. I was so engrossed in the chase that I tried to lose sight of it many times. I even lost my footing and fell over several times. But when I came under a large oak tree with thick branches, I was fortunate to find a grazing cow blocking the kappa's path. It was a bull with thick horns and bloodshot eyes. When the kappa saw the bull, it let out a shriek and dodged into the particularly tall Japanese bamboo grass. I thought to myself, "I've got you," so I ran after it. There must have been a hole there that I didn't know about. Just as I felt my fingertips finally touch the kappa's smooth back, I fell headfirst into deep darkness. But even in such dire situations, our human minds are capable of thinking of the most extraordinary things. With a sudden "ah," I remembered that there was a bridge called Kappa Bridge near the hot springs in Kamikochi. And then, I don't remember what happened after that. I just felt something similar to lightning in front of me, and before I knew it, I had lost my sanity. When I finally came to, I found myself lying face up, surrounded by a large number of kappa. Not only that, but a kappa with a pair of glasses and a pair of spectacles on its thick beak was kneeling beside me and putting a stethoscope to my chest. When the kappa saw me open my eyes, he made a hand gesture for me to be quiet, then called out, "Quacks, quacks," to a kappa behind me. Then, from somewhere, 2 kappa came walking towards me carrying a stretcher. I was placed on this stretcher and we walked quietly through the crowd of kappa for several blocks. The towns lined up on both sides of me were not dissimilar to Ginza Street. As expected, various shops lined up their sunshades in the shade of rows of zelkova trees, and many cars were driving along the road between the rows of trees. Before long, the stretcher carrying me turned down a narrow alley and was carried into a house. I later found out that this was the home of the kappa with the gold-eye nose, the doctor named Chuck. Chuck laid me down on a neat bed. Then he gave me a cup of some kind of clear liquid medicine. I lay down on the bed and did whatever Chuck did. In fact, my joints were hurting so much that I could barely move. Chuck came to check on me 2 or 3 times a day. About once every 3 days, the kappa I first saw, a fisherman named Bag, would come to see me. Kappa know far more about humans than we humans know about them. That's probably because kappa capture humans far more often than we humans capture them. Even though we never managed to capture any, we humans had come to the land of kappas many times before me. And many of us had even lived in the land of kappas our whole lives. Why? Because we are not just kappas, but humans, and because of this privilege, we can earn a living without working. According to Bag's story, a young road worker had also come to this land by chance, married a female kappa, and lived there until his death. The female kappa was the most beautiful woman in the land, and was also extremely skilled at deceiving her husband, the road worker. After about a week, I was forced to live next to Chuck as a specially protected resident according to the laws of this country. My house was small but elegant. Of course, the civilization of this country is not that different from that of our human nation, at least from that of Japan. There was a small piano in the corner of the living room facing the street, and picture frames hung on the wall. However, the dimensions of the house itself, as well as the table and chairs, were all designed to fit a kappa's height, so it felt inconvenient, as if I was living in a child's room. I would always invite Zip and Bag into this room at dusk and learn the kappa's language. And it wasn't just them. As a specially protected resident, everyone was curious about me, so the president of a glass company called Gil, who would call Zip and have his blood pressure checked every day, would also show up in this room. But during the first week or so, the person who became closest to me was none other than that fisherman named Bag. It was dusk on a warm, stormy day. I was sitting at the table in this room, facing Fisherman's Bag. Then, Bag suddenly went quiet and stared at me with his big eyes widened even more. Of course, I thought this was strange, so I said, "Quacks, Bag, quo quel, quan?" This translates to, "Hey, Bag, what's wrong?" But Bag didn't reply. He suddenly stood up, stuck out his tongue, and even looked like he was going to jump at me like a frog. I felt even more uneasy, so I quietly stood up from my chair and tried to jump out the door. Luckily, it was Chuck, a doctor, who appeared just then. "Hey, Bag, what are you doing?" Chuck, still wearing his glasses, glared at Bag. Bag then seemed frightened and repeatedly put his hands to his head as he apologized to Chuck, saying, "I am truly sorry." The truth is, I was amused by how disgusting you looked, so I got carried away and played a little prank on you. Please forgive me, sir. Before I continue, I must explain a little about Kappa. It is still questionable whether Kappa really exist. However, since I myself have lived among them, there should be no room for doubt. So, what kind of animal are they? They have short hair on their heads and webbed hands and feet, which is not significantly different from what appears in Suko Karayaku. Their height is probably just over 1 meter. According to Chuck, the doctor, they weigh between 20 and 30 pounds. But occasionally there are large kappas that weigh as much as 50 or so pounds. They also have an oval head in the middle of their head, which seems to get harder as they age. In fact, the head of an older Bag feels completely different to the head of a young Chuck. But the most mysterious thing about them is the color of their skin. Kappa do not have a fixed skin color like humans. They change to the same color as their surroundings. For example, when they are in grass, they turn green like the grass, and when they are on a rock, they turn gray like the rock. Of course, this is not limited to kappa, but also happens to chameleons. Or kappa may have something similar to a chameleon in their skin tissue. When I discovered this fact, I remembered the folklore records that kappa in the west are green and kappa in the northeast are red. Not only that, but I also remembered that when I was chasing a bag, it suddenly disappeared and I didn't know where it had gone. Moreover, kappa seem to have a very thick layer of fat under their skin, and they live in this underground country, where the temperature is relatively low. Average is around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and they are unaware of the existence of kimono. Of course, all kappa wear goggles, carry a cigarette box, and have a money pouch. But kappa have pouches in their stomachs like kangaroos, so they have no trouble storing these things. But what seemed strange to me was that they don't even cover their waists. One day I asked Bag why this habit happened, to which Bag simply leaned back and laughed out loud. To top it off, it replied, "I think it's strange that you're hiding something." Gradually, I learned the everyday words that kappa use. As a result, I began to understand the customs and habits of kappa. The strangest thing about them is that kappa find things that we humans take seriously funny, but at the same time, they take things that we humans find funny seriously. This is a ridiculous habit. For example, we humans take things like justice and humanity seriously, but when kappa hear such things, they burst out laughing. In other words, their idea of what is funny is completely different from our idea of what is funny. One time, I was talking to Chuck, a doctor, about birth control. Chuck opened his mouth wide and laughed so hard that his nose glasses fell off. Of course, I was angry, so I asked him what was funny. I remember Chuck's response was roughly like this, although I might be wrong on some of the details. After all, at that time I still didn't fully understand the language kappa used. But it's strange to only think about your parents' convenience. It's too selfish. Instead, from our human perspective, there is nothing stranger than a kappa giving birth. In fact, after a while, I went to Bag's hut to watch Bag's wife give birth. When kappas give birth, they do the same thing as us humans. They also give birth with the help of a doctor and a midwife. However, when the baby is about to be born, the father puts his mouth to the mother's genitals as if he were making a phone call, and asks in a loud voice, think carefully about whether you want to be born into this world and then give me an answer." Bag also got on his knees and repeated this over and over again. Then he gargled with a disinfectant liquid medicine that was on the table. The baby in his wife's belly seemed a little worried and replied in a low voice, "I don't want to be born. First of all, my father's inheritance of mental illness is a big problem. On top of that, I believe that kappa-like beings are bad." Bag scratched his head when he heard this reply. However, the midwife who was there immediately inserted a thick glass tube into his wife's genitals and injected some kind of liquid. Then his wife let out a deep breath of relief. At the same time, her large belly deflated like a balloon that had had the hydrogen gas let out. If they reply like this, then of course kappa babies walk and talk soon after they are born. Apparently, Chuck said that one child gave a lecture about the existence of God on the 26th day after birth. However, that child died in the second month. While we're on the subject of childbirth, let me tell you about a large poster I happened to come across on a corner of town on the third month after I arrived in this country. At the bottom of the poster were drawings of 12 or 13 kappa, some blowing trumpets and some holding swords. Above that was a whole range of spiral characters used by kappa, similar to the springs in clocks. When you translate these spiral characters, they roughly mean something like this. Again, I might be wrong in the details. But anyway, I took note of every word that a kappa student named Rap, who was walking with me, read out loud to me. Recruiting the Genetic Volunteer Corps. Healthy male and female kappa. To eradicate bad genetics, marry unhealthy male and female kappa. I, of course, told Rap at the time that such a thing would not be done. Then, not only Rap, but all the kappas in Poster's neighborhood burst out laughing. No? Because from what you say, you guys do it just like us. What do you think it is for a son to fall in love with a maid or a daughter to fall in love with a driver? They are all unconsciously eradicating bad genes. First of all, compared to your human volunteer corps that you talked about the other day, the volunteer corps that kill each other to take over a single railroad, I think our volunteer corps are much more noble. Rap said this seriously, but his fat belly was constantly flopping around in a funny way. But instead of laughing, I hurriedly tried to grab a kappa. That's because I noticed that the kappa had taken advantage of my carelessness and stolen my fountain pen. But the kappa's smooth skin made it difficult for us to catch it. The kappa slipped through and quickly escaped. He leaned his body, thin like a mosquito, so far back that it looked like he might fall over. This kappa named Rap looked after me just as well as he looked after my bag. But the most unforgettable moment was when I was introduced to a kappa named Talk. Talk is a poet and fellow kappa. Just like us humans, poets have long hair. I would sometimes go to Talk's house to kill time. Talk always lived a carefree life, arranging potted alpine plants in his small room, writing poetry and smoking cigarettes. In a corner of the room, a female kappa Talk is a free love lover, so he doesn't have a wife, was knitting or something. Whenever Talk saw me, he would smile and say, although it's not a very nice thing for a kappa to smile. At least I found it rather creepy at first. Hey, welcome. Come on, sit on that chair. Talk often talked about the life of kappa and kappa art. Talk believed that there was nothing more absurd than the ordinary life of a kappa. Parents, children, spouses, siblings, and so on all live with the sole joy of tormenting each other. In particular, the family system is more absurd than absurd. One day, Talk pointed outside the window and spat out, "Look at how stupid they are." Outside the window, a young kappa was walking around gasping for breath, with 7 or 8 kappas, including what appeared to be his parents, hanging around its neck. However, I was impressed by the young kappa's sacrificial spirit, so I praised his bravery instead. You are qualified to become a citizen of this country. Are you a socialist? I answered, of course, which means it is so in kappa's words. Then you would not hesitate to sacrifice one genius for the sake of 100 ordinary people. Then what kind of ideology are you? Someone said that Talk's beliefs are anarchism, but me? I am a Superman, literally a super kappa. Talk declared proudly. Talk has a unique idea about art. According to Talk, art is not controlled by anything, it is art for art's sake, and therefore an artist must be a Superman who has completely eliminated good and evil above all else. However, this is not necessarily Talk's opinion alone. Most of Talk's fellow poets seem to agree. In fact, I often went to the Superman Club with Talk. The people who gather at the Superman Club are poets, novelists, playwrights, critics, painters, musicians, sculptors, and artistic amateurs. But they are all supermen. They were always chatting cheerfully in the brightly lit salon. And sometimes they would show off their superhuman qualities with aplomb. For example, one sculptor caught a young kappa in the middle of a large potted fern and played with sodomy. Another female novelist stood up on the table and drank 60 bottles of absinthe. However, she rolled off the table at the 60th bottle and died immediately. One fine evening, I came home from the Superman Club with the poet Talk arm in arm. Talk was unusually depressed and didn't say a word. One day, we passed a small window with a fire burning. Beyond that window, a couple of kappas, a male and female, were sitting at the dinner table with 3 baby kappas. Then Talk suddenly spoke to me, sighing. I consider myself a superhuman lover, but when I see a family like that, I still feel envious. But don't you think that's a contradiction no matter how you look at it? But Talk remained still with his arms folded under the moonlight, watching the other side of the small window, the peaceful dinner table of the 5 kappas. After a while, he replied, "After all, those omelets over there are more hygienic than love or anything like that. In fact, kappa love is quite different from human love. As soon as a female kappa finds a suitable male kappa, she will stop at nothing to catch him, and the most honest female kappa will chase him with all her might. I have actually seen female kappas chasing male kappa like crazy. But that's not all. Not only young female kappas, but even the parents and siblings of the kappa join in the chase. The male kappa are the ones who are the most pitiful. After all, even if they are lucky enough to avoid being caught after running around for so long, they end up lying on the floor for 2 or 3 months. One day, I was reading a collection of poems by Talk at my house when that student, Rap, came running in. When Lap stumbled into my house, he collapsed on the floor and said, out of breath, "This is so bad. I'm finally caught her." I quickly threw down the book of poems and locked the door. However, when I looked through the keyhole, I saw a short female kappa with sulfur powder on her face still wandering around the door. Lap slept on my floor for several weeks after that day. And one day his beak rotted away and fell off. However, sometimes there are male kappas who chase female kappas with all their might. But in reality, it is the female kappa who makes them feel compelled to chase. I also saw male kappas chasing female kappas like they were crazy. While fleeing, the female kappa would sometimes stop on purpose or get on all fours. What's more, when the time was right, she would easily let the female kappa catch her, as if she was disappointed. The male kappa I saw rolled around there for a while, holding the female kappa. But when he finally got up, he had a look of disappointment, regret, or at least a pitiful expression on his face that was hard to describe. But that was okay. Among the kappa I saw was a small male kappa chasing a female kappa. The female kappa was making her usual seductive escape. Then, from the town across the street, a large male kappa came walking towards me, snorting. The female kappa happened to see the male kappa and cried out in a shrill voice, "I'm in big trouble. Help me. That kappa is trying to kill me." Of course, the big male kappa caught the little one in an instant and pinned him down in the middle of the road. The little kappa grabbed the empty sack with his webbed hands a couple of times and finally died. But by that time the female kappa was grinning and clinging tightly to the big kappa's neck. All the male kappas I knew had been chased by female kappas, as if by agreement. Of course, Mr. Bag, who has a wife and children, was chased as well. And they would be caught a couple of times. The only exception was the philosopher Mag the kappa next to the poet Talk, who had never been caught. One reason for this is that there are very few kappas as ugly as Mag. But another reason is that Mag is the only one who rarely goes out on the street and spends all his time at home. I sometimes went to Mag's house to talk. Mag always had a rainbow-colored glass lantern lit in his dimly lit room, and he would sit at his high-legged desk and read thick books. One day, I discussed this love story between Mag and a kappa. Why doesn't the government crack down more on female kappas chasing male kappas? One reason is that there are not many female kappas among the government officials. Female kappas are more jealous than male kappas, so if there were more female kappa government officials, male kappas would surely be able to live without being chased. But the effectiveness of that is unclear. See why? Even among government officials, female kappas chase male kappas. So you're the happiest person to live like you are. Mag then got up from his chair, held both of my hands, and said with a sigh, "You're not one of us kappas, so it's only natural that you don't understand. But sometimes I feel like I want to be chased by those scary female kappas too." I also went to concerts with the poet Talk many times. But I still can't forget the third concert I went to. The appearance of the hall was not much different from Japan. As expected, there were 300 or 400 kappas, both male and female, sitting on the gradually rising seats, all holding programs and listening intently. At this third concert, I was sitting in the front row with Talk and his female kappa, as well as the philosopher Mag. After the cello solo ended, a kappa with strangely narrow eyes came up to the stage, casually holding a music book. Just as the program tells us, this kappa was a famous composer named Krabak. Just as the program tells us, no, there's no need to look at the program. Krabak is a member of the Superman Club, to which Talk belongs, so I knew his face. Lied Krabak, the program in this country was mostly German. After a brief bow to us amidst the enthusiastic applause, Krabak quietly walked over to the piano. Then, just as usual, he began to play his own Lied. According to Talk, Krabak is a genius unparalleled among all musicians born in this country. I was interested in Krabak's music, as well as his side job of lyric poetry, so I listened intently to the sound of the large bow-shaped piano. Talk and Mag were probably even more ecstatic than I was. However, the beautiful, at least according to the kappa's stories, female kappa held the program tightly and occasionally stuck out her long tongue in an irritated manner. According to Mag, he had missed his chance to catch Krabak about 10 years ago, and so he still holds the musician in hostility. Krabak put all his passion into playing the piano as if he was fighting. Then suddenly, a voice rang out like a thunderclap throughout the hall, "No playing." Surprised by the voice, I instinctively turned around. The voice belonged to a tall policeman sitting at the very back, who calmly sat down and shouted, "No playing," again, louder than before. And then what happened next was total chaos. Police brutality. Crackback, play. Play. You idiot. Damn you. Get out of here. Don't give up. Chairs toppled, programs flew, and on top of that, empty cider bottles, pebbles, and even half-eaten cucumbers started raining down on us. I was stunned, so I tried to ask Talk why. But Talk seemed to be excited too, and stood up on his chair, yelling, "Crackback, play. Play." And Talk's female kappa seemed to have forgotten her hostility at some point, as she was still yelling police brutality, just like Talk. I had no choice but to turn to Mag and ask, "What's wrong? Is this it? This is common in this country. Art and literature are originally." Mag explained as quietly as ever, tucking his neck in a little whenever something flew at him. Art and literature are originally something that anyone can see clearly, so in this country they are never banned from being sold or exhibited. Instead, they are banned from being played. After all, music is the only thing that earless kappas can't understand, no matter how corrupting the music may be. But does that officer have ears? Well, that's questionable. Perhaps he was listening to that melody and remembered the sound of his heart beating when he was sleeping with his wife. Meanwhile, the commotion was getting more and more intense. Krabak was still at the piano, looking back at us with a haughty look on his face. But no matter how haughty he was, he couldn't avoid the things that flew at him. So, in other words, his attitude changed every few seconds. But generally speaking, he maintained the dignity of a great musician, his narrow eyes shining with dread. Of course, I was also carrying a toque as a shield to avoid danger. But I was still curious, and I continued to talk to Mag enthusiastically. Isn't that censorship a bit harsh? Well, it's actually more advanced than the censorship of any other country. Take XX, for example. In fact, only a month ago. I was just about to say this when the bottle fell on Mag's head, so he cried out, "Quack! This is just an interjection," and finally fainted.
I had a strange affection for Gale, the president of the glass company. Gale was the capitalist of capitalists. There must have been no kappa in this country with a belly as big as Gale, but sitting in an easy chair with his wife, who looked like a lychee, and his child, who looked like a cucumber on either side. He looked almost happy. I sometimes went to dinner at the Gale house, accompanied by Pep the judge and Chuck the doctor, with a letter of introduction from Gale. I also looked around at various factories with which Gale and his friends had some kind of connection. Of all these factories, the one that was particularly interesting to me was the book manufacturing company's factory. When I went inside this factory with a young Kappa engineer and looked at the large machines powered by hydroelectricity, I was amazed at the progress of the mechanical industry in the country of Kappa. Apparently, they produce 7 million books a year there. But it wasn't the number of books that surprised me. It was how little effort it took to produce that many books. After all, in this country, to make a book, all you have to do is put paper, ink, and a gray powder into the funnel-shaped opening of the machine. Once these raw materials enter the machine, within about 5 minutes, they come out as countless books, including chrysanthemum-sized books, Shiroku-sized books, and Hansei-sized books. As I watched the various books cascading down like a waterfall, I asked the warped Kappa engineer what the gray powder was called. Standing in front of the shining black machine, the engineer replied with a bored look on his face, "Is this it? This is a donkey's brain." Yes, it was dried and roughly powdered. The current price is about 23 cents per ton. Of course, such industrial miracles do not only happen in book manufacturers. They happen in picture manufacturers and music manufacturers as well. Actually, according to Gale, 700 to 800 new machines are invented in this country on average per month, and mass production is carried out without waiting for manpower. As a result, no less than 40,000 workers are laid off, and yet, even though I read the newspaper every morning in this country, I have never come across the word strike. I thought this was strange, so one day, when I was invited to dinner at the Gale family home with Pep and Chuck, I asked them why. They all eat it up. Gale, smoking a cigar after the meal, said this with a very casual and rude look, but I didn't know what eat meant. Then Chuck, wearing glasses with gold-eye nose, seemed to sense my suspicions and explained from the side, "They're going to kill all the workers and use the meat for food. Look at the newspaper here. Just this month, 64,769 workers were laid off, and that's how much the price of meat has dropped. Are the workers going to be killed without saying a word? There's no point in making a fuss about that. There's a law for slaughtering workers." These were the words of Pep, who had a bitter look on his face, with a potted bayberry tree behind him. Of course, I felt uncomfortable, but it seems that not only Gale, the main character, but also Pep and Chuck think that this is natural. In fact, Chuck was laughing and talking to me in a mocking tone. So the government is saving them the trouble of starving to death or committing suicide. They'll only have to inhale a little poisonous gas, so it won't be too painful. But to eat that meat, don't make that joke. If you told Mag that, he'd laugh out loud. Aren't the girls of the Fourth Estate turning into prostitutes in your country, too? It's sentimental to be outraged by the idea of eating a worker's meat. Jir, who had been listening to this exchange, offered me a plate of sandwiches from the nearby table and said to me with a calm face, "How about one? Would you like one? It's also a worker's meat." I was, of course, disgusted. But that wasn't all. I ran out of the Jir family's drawing room with the laughter of Pep and Chuck behind me. It was a stormy night, with no stars visible in the sky above the houses. As I walked through the darkness back to my house, I vomited nonstop. Even in the dark, a white stream of vomit flowed out. But Gale, the president of the glass company, must have been a friendly kappa. I often went with Gale to the club. Gale belonged to and spent the night there happily. One reason for this was that the club was much more comfortable than the Superman Club Talk belonged to. And although Gale's stories were not as profound as those of the Philosopher Mag, they gave me a glimpse into a whole new world, a wider world. Gale would always talk about all sorts of things, cheerfully, stirring his coffee cup with a pure gold spoon. One foggy night, I would listen to Gale's stories while sitting in a vase filled with winter roses. I remember that it was a secession-style room where the entire room, as well as the chairs and tables, were white with thin gold edging. Gale looked even more proud than usual, with a smile shining across his face as he spoke about the Kurex party government that was ruling the country at the time. The word Kurex is just a meaningless interjection, so it can only be translated as "oh." But anyway, it was a political party that advocated the interests of all kappas above all else. The one who controls the Kurex party is the famous politician Lope. Bismarck once said, "Honesty is the best diplomacy," but Lope extends honesty to internal affairs as well. But Lope's speech, well, listen to what I'm saying. That speech was, of course, a complete lie, but everyone knows it's a lie. So in the end, it's no different from honesty. It's your own prejudice to call it a lie. We kappas are like you, but that's irrelevant. What I want to talk about is Lope. Lope controls the Kurex party, and Lope is controlled by Pofo. This is Kikui, the president of the newspaper. This word, "pew-few," is also a meaningless interjection. If you were to translate it forcefully, it would be nothing more than "ah." But Kikui is not his own master. The one who controls Kikui is Gale, who is in front of you. But, and this may be rude, but the Pew-Few newspaper is a newspaper that favors the workers. The fact that the president, Kikui is also under your control. The reporters at the Fu newspaper are, of course, on the side of the workers. But the only one who controls the reporters is Kikui, and Kikui cannot help but receive the patronage of Gale. Gale is still smiling and playing with the pure gold spoon. When I see Gale like this, I feel more sympathy for the reporters at the Fu newspaper than I hate Gale himself. Gale seemed to sense my sympathy for his silence and said with a bloated belly, "You see, not all the reporters at Fu newspaper are on the side of the workers. At least we Kappas always take our own side before taking anyone else's side. But what's even more troublesome and bothersome is that even Gale himself is under the control of someone else. Who do you think that is? It's my wife, the beautiful Mrs. Gale laughed loudly. That would be a happy thing. Anyway, I am satisfied, but I can only boast about this to you, since you are not a Kappa. So that means that Madame Gale is in control of the Quirax cabinet. I suppose that's what you would say, but the war 7 years ago must have been started because of a certain female Kappa. War? Has there been a war in this country? Yes, there has been. We don't know when there will be another one in the future. As long as there are neighboring countries, after all, it was only then that I learned that the Kappa country is not isolated as a nation. According to Gale's explanation, the Kappa always make the otter a hypothetical enemy, and the otter is equipped with military equipment that is just as good as the Kappas. I was quite interested in this story of the Kappas' war against the otter. After all, the fact that otters are a strong enemy of Kappa is a new fact that even Yanagida Kunio, the author of Suko Kurieku and Santo Mintenshu, was apparently unaware of. Before the war broke out, both countries were, of course, on their guard, watching each other closely. That is because both were equally afraid of each other. Then, an otter living in this country visited a Kappa couple. The female Kappa was planning to kill her husband. After all, the husband was a playboy, and he had no life insurance. So the dangerous situation may have been a bit of a temptation. Do you know the couple? Yes, I know only the male Kappa. My wife and others say that he is a villain. But if you ask me, he is more of a paranoid madman who is afraid of being caught by the female Kappa than a villain. So the female Kappa put some cyanide potassium in her husband's cocoa cup. Then, by some mistake, she gave it to the guest's otter to drink. Of course, the otter died, and then war broke out. Yes, Unfortunately, that otter had a medal. Who won the war? Of course, our country won. 369,500 Kappas died bravely in battle, but compared to the enemy country, that amount of damage is nothing. Most of the fur in this country comes from otters. During that war, in addition to manufacturing glass, I also sent cinder husks to the battlefield. What do you use cinder husks for? Of course, we use them for food. We know that Kappas will eat anything if they are hungry. Please don't get angry. That's a scandal in our country. But for Kappas on the battlefield, it's a scandal in our country too. But if I say it myself, no one will make it a scandal. The philosopher Mag also said, "Speak thy evil, evil will disappear of itself." And besides profit, I was also burning with patriotism. Just then, the waiter from the club came in. After bowing to Gale, the waiter recited the following to him. "There's a fire next door to yours." Fire, fire. Gale stood up in surprise. Of course, I stood up too. But the waiter calmly added the following words, "But it's already out." Gale had a look on his face that was close to tears and laughter as he saw the waiter off. When I saw his face like this, I realized that I had once hated the president of this glass company, but now Gale was standing there as just a kappa, not a big capitalist or anything like that. I took out a winter rose from the vase and handed it to Gale. "But even though the fire is out, your wife will be very surprised. Here, take this and go home." "Thank you." Gale shook my hand. Then he suddenly laughed and spoke to me in a low voice. "The house next door is my builder. I can at least get the fire insurance money." I still vividly remember Gale. A smile that I could neither despise nor hate. "What's wrong? You seem strangely depressed again today, don't you?" It was the day after the fire. I said this to Rap, a student, sitting on a chair in my guest room, smoking a cigarette. In fact, Rap was once again resting his left leg on top of his right, staring blankly at the floor, unable to even see his rotten beak. "What's wrong, Rap?" I said, and he said, "Oh, nothing. It's nothing." Rap finally raised his head and let out a sad snort. Today, while looking out the window, I casually muttered, "The bug-catching violets have bloomed." My sister's face suddenly changed color, and she lashed out, "I am just a bug-catching violet anyway. What's more, my mother is also a huge fan of her sister, so she got mad at me too. Why does your sister find it unpleasant that But catching violets have bloomed? Well, maybe she took it to mean that she was going to catch a male kappa. So, my aunt and uncle, who didn't get along with my mother, joined the fight, and it became a big mess when my father, who is drunk all year round, heard about the fight. He started beating everyone without discrimination. To make matters worse, my younger brother stole my mother's wallet and went to the movies or something. I really... Lap buried his face in his hands and cried without saying a word. Of course, I sympathized with him. At the same time, I remembered the poet Tok's contempt for the family system. I patted Lap on the shoulder and did my best to comfort him. That happens everywhere. Be brave. But if only his beak wasn't rotten, there's no choice but to give up. Let's go to Tok's house. Tok looks down on me. I can't abandon my family as boldly as Tok. Then let's go to Krebak's house. Since that concert, I had become friends with Krebak, so I decided to take Rap to the great musician's house. Krebak lives a much more luxurious life than Tok. That doesn't mean that he lives like the capitalist Gale. He just has a Turkish-style bench in his room, filled with various antiques, Tanagra dolls, and Persian pottery. And he always plays with his children under a portrait of Krebak himself. But today, he was sitting with his arms folded across his chest and a bitter look on his face. Not only that, but the ground was also littered with scraps of paper. Rap must have met Krebak many times with the poet Tok. However, he seemed frightened by his condition, so today he bowed politely and sat down in a corner of the room in silence. "What's the matter, Mr. Krebak? Krebak?" I asked the great musician, almost as a greeting. "What should I do?" "You fool critics! You say my lyric poetry can't compare with Tok's lyric poetry. But you're a musician, so I can bear that. You say I'm not worthy of the name of a musician compared to Locke, right? Locke is a musician who is often compared to Krebak. Unfortunately, I'm not a member of the Superman Club, so I've never spoken to him. However, I had often seen his quirky face, with its upturned beak, in photographs. Rock is undoubtedly a genius, but his music lacks the modern passion that permeates your music. Do you really think so? I certainly do. With that, Krebak stood up, grabbed the Tanagra doll, and slammed it onto the floor. Lap seemed very surprised, yelling something and trying to run away. But Krebak made a gesture of his hands to Rap and me, as if to say, "Don't be surprised," and then said coldly, "That's because you, like the common man, don't have ears. I'm afraid of rock. You? Stop trying to act humble. Who wants to act humble? I'd rather act humble in front of critics than act humble in front of you. I'm a genius. I'm not afraid of rock. So what are you afraid of? Something unknown, the planet that rules rock, if you like. That doesn't make sense to me. Then, that's how I understand it. Rock isn't influenced by me, but before I know it, I'm influenced by rock. That's because of your sensibility. Well, listen. It's not a question of sensibility or anything like that. Rock is always content to do what only he can do. But it irritates me. In Rock's eyes, it may be a step difference, but to me it's a whole mile difference. But your heroic songs. Crackback narrowed his narrow eyes even more and glared at Rap in annoyance. Shut up. What do you know? I know rock. I know rock better than the dogs that bow before rock. Now, be quiet for a moment. If you could be quiet. I always think that something unknown to us made rock stand before me to mock me, Craback. Mag the philosopher knows all about this, even though he always reads old books under that colored glass lamp. Why? Look at this book that Mag wrote recently, called Foolish Words. Craback handed me a book, or rather threw it at me. Then, with his arms folded again, he said bluntly, "Well, I'll be off today." I decided to go out again to the street with a dejected Rap. The busy street was still lined with various shops. Under the shade of the Zelkova trees, we walked along in silence without incident. Then, a long-haired poet named Tok passed by. When Tok saw our faces, he took a handkerchief out of his pouch and wiped his forehead several times. "Hello. It's been a while since we last saw each other. I'm thinking of visiting Craback today for the first time in a while. I thought it would be bad to get these artists fighting, so I told Tok in a roundabout way about Craback's obvious bad mood." "I see. Well, let's not do that. Craback has a nervous breakdown after all. I haven't been able to sleep for the past few weeks, and I'm feeling weak too. How about you come for a walk with us?" "No, let's not do that today." "Oh!" As soon as Tok shouted this, he grabbed my arm tightly, and before I knew it, I was covered in cold sweat all over my body. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" It looked like a green monkey was sticking its head out of the car window. I was a little worried, so I suggested that he should be examined by that doctor, Chuck. But Tok showed no sign of agreeing. He even looked back and forth between us suspiciously and said this: "I'm definitely not an anarchist. Please don't forget that. Good day. I'm not going to see Chuck again. We stood there blankly, watching Taka's back. Before we knew it, the student rep was standing in the middle of the road, peering through his gold-plated glasses at the endless cars and people passing by. I thought that this Kappa had gone mad, so I woke him up in surprise. That's not a joke. What are you doing? But Rap rubbed his eyes and replied surprisingly calmly, No, I was so depressed that I looked at the world upside down. But it's the same thing. These are some chapters from The Words of Fools, written by Philosopher Mag. A fool always believes that everyone else is a fool. We love nature because nature does not hate us or become jealous. The wisest life is to live with contempt for the customs of an age, without breaking any of those customs. The only things we can be most proud of are those we do not have. No one has any objection to destroying idols. At the same time, no one has any objection to becoming an idol. But those who can sit comfortably on the pedestal of an idol are those most favored by the gods, fools, villains, or heroes. Crackback left claw marks on this chapter. The ideas necessary for our life may have run out 3,000 years ago. We will only add new fire to old firewood. Our characteristics are accustomed to transcending our own consciousness. If happiness is accompanied by pain and peace by boredom, then what? It is harder to defend oneself than to defend others. If you doubt, see a lawyer. Pride, lust, doubt. All sins have come from these three for 3,000 years. And perhaps all virtues too. Reducing material desires does not necessarily bring peace. We must also reduce spiritual desires to have peace. Kreback left claw marks on this chapter as well. We are more unfortunate than humans. Humans are not as evolved as Kappa. I couldn't help but laugh when I read this chapter. What is accomplished is what can be accomplished. And what can be accomplished is what is accomplished. Ultimately, our lives cannot escape this circular reasoning. That is, they are completely irrational. After Baudelaire became an idiot, he expressed his view of life in just one word, the vagina. But this is not necessarily what he said. Rather, he forgot the word stomach because he trusted in his genius. The poetic genius that was enough to sustain his life. The marks of Krebeck's claws were still visible in this chapter. If reason is the end, we must naturally deny our own existence. The fact that Voltaire, who made reason a god, ended his life in happiness shows that humans are less evolved than Kappa. It was a relatively cold afternoon. I was tired of reading foolish words. So I went out to look for Mag the philosopher. Then, at the corner of a lonely town, I saw a mosquito-thin kappa leaning against a wall, and it was undoubtedly the kappa who had stolen my fountain pen some time ago. I thought I had him, so I called out to a burly policeman who happened to be passing by. Please interrogate that kappa. He stole my fountain pen just about a month ago. The policeman raised his stick in his right hand. Policemen in this country carry sticks made of pine instead of swords, and called out to the kappa, "Hey you!" I thought the kappa might run away, but he was surprisingly calm and walked up to the policeman. Not only that, he had his arms folded and was staring at me and the policeman with a very arrogant look on his face. However, the policeman did not get angry, but took out his notebook from his pouch and began his questioning. "What is your name, Gluck? What is your occupation?" "I was a postman until a few days ago." "Very well. Yes, I stole it about a month ago." "What for?" "I wanted to use it as a child's toy." "And the child?" The policeman looked at the other kappa for the first time with a sharp gaze. "He died a week ago. Do you have a death certificate?" The skinny kappa took out a piece of paper from his pouch. The policeman looked over the paper, then suddenly grinned and patted the man on the shoulder. "Very well. Thank you for your hard work." I was stunned and looked at the policeman's face, and before long, the skinny kappa muttered something to himself and left us behind. I finally regained my composure and asked the policeman, "Why don't you catch that kappa? That kappa is innocent." "But who stole my fountain pen?" "Maybe it was for a child to play with, but the child is dead. If you have any doubts, check Article 1285 of the Criminal Code." The policeman said this and quickly walked away. I had no choice, so I repeated Article 1285 of the Criminal Code to myself and hurried to Mag's house. Mag the philosopher likes to have guests. In fact, today, the dimly lit room was filled with people such as Pep, the judge, Chuck the doctor, and Gale, the glass company president, and cigarette smoke was rising under the rainbow-colored glass lamp. I was especially pleased that Judge Pep was there. As soon as I sat down, instead of examining Article 1285 of the Criminal Code, I immediately asked Pep a question. "Pep, I'm sorry to ask, but don't criminals in this country punish themselves?" Pep puffed smoke from his gold-capped cigarette and replied with a bored look on his face, "Of course they do. They even carry out the death penalty, but I was just a month away. After I explained the details. I asked him about Article 1285 of the Criminal Code. Well, it's like this no matter what crime a person commits. Once the circumstances that caused them to commit the crime have disappeared, that criminal cannot be punished. In other words, in your case, the Kappa was once child's parent, but now it's no longer the parent, so the crime naturally disappears. That seems absurd. Don't make such jokes. It's absurd to see a Kappa that was a parent and a Kappa that is a parent as the same. That's right. In Japanese law, they are seen as the same. That seems ridiculous to us. Ha 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 ha. Pep threw his cigarette away and let out a half-hearted smirk. Then Chuck, who has no experience with law, spoke up. Chuck adjusted his nose glasses and asked me this question. Do they have the death penalty in Japan? Yes, they do. They use hanging in Japan. I felt a little resentful towards Pep's cold, reserved attitude, so I took the opportunity to throw a sarcastic remark at him. Isn't the death penalty in this country more civilized than in Japan? Of course it is. Pep was just as calm. We don't use hanging in this country. Sometimes we use electricity, but most of the time we don't use electricity either. We just tell them the name of the crime. Does that kill a Kappa? Yes, they do. Our nervous system is more sensitive than yours. And it's not just the death penalty. We use that method for murder too. The company president, Gale, flashed a friendly smile as his face turned purple in the light of the tinted glass. The other day, a socialist told me, "You're a thief," and I nearly had a heart attack. That seems to be a fairly common thing. A lawyer I knew died because of it. I looked back at the Kappa who'd spoken, Mag the philosopher. Mag was still talking, his usual sarcastic smile on his face. Without looking at anyone, someone called that Kappa a frog. And of course, you know that in this country, being called a frog means being a non-human. And he wondered every day whether he was a frog or not. And he eventually died. That was suicide. In other words, although the person who called that Kappa a frog did so with the intention of killing him, in your eyes, that was also suicide. Just as Mag was saying this, a sharp pistol shot suddenly rang out from the other side of the wall of the room. Definitely in the poet Talk's house, as if ricocheting the air. We rushed to Talk's house. Talk was lying face up in a pot of alpine plants, with a pistol in his right hand and blood coming out of his head. Next to him, a female kappa was burying her face in Talk's chest and crying loudly. I picked her up and asked her, "What happened?" I don't really like touching the slimy skin of kappas. I don't know what happened. I was just writing something, and then suddenly I hit him on the head with the pistol. Oh, what should I do? Kurr, kurr. This is the cry of a kappa. After all, Tuck was a selfish person. Gale, the president of the glass company, shook his head sadly and said to Pep, the judge. But Pep said nothing as he lit a roll of cigarettes in his metal mouth. Then Chuck, who had been kneeling and examining Tuck's wounds, declared to the five of us in a very doctor-like manner, actually, one person and four others. It's no good anymore. Tuck has always had stomach problems, and that alone made him prone to depression. I hear you were writing something. Mag, the philosopher, muttered to himself apologetically as he picked up the paper from the desk. We all tensed our necks except for me and peered at the piece of paper over Mag's broad shoulder. Let's go to the valley that separates the world of evil, to the valley where the rocks are cold, the mountain water is pure, and the scent of medicinal flowers. Mag looked back at us and said with a bitter smile, "This is a plagiarism of Goethe's Mignonen's song." So Tuck committed suicide because he was tired as a poet. By chance, the musician Krebak drove up there. Seeing this, Krebak stood at the door for a while. But then he walked up to us and started yelling at Mag. "Is that Tuck's will? No, it's the last poem he was writing." Poem! Mag, still without a fuss, handed Tuck's manuscript to Krebak, his hair standing on end. Krebak read the poem intently without even looking around. Moreover, he barely responded to Mag's words. "What do you think about Tuck's death? Now, I don't know when I'll die too. To the valley that separates the world of the living. But you and Tuck were best friends, weren't you? Best friends." Tuck was always lonely. To the valley that separates the world of the living. But unfortunately, Tuck, the rocks were cold. Unfortunately, the mountain water is pure. You are fortunate. The rocks are cold. I felt sorry for the female kappa who was still crying, so I gently put my arm around her shoulders and led her to a long bench in the corner of the room. There was a kappa, maybe 2 or 3 years old, smiling without knowing anything. I soothed the baby kappa in place of the female kappa. Then, one day, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. This was the only time I had ever shed tears while living in Kappa country. But I feel sorry for the family that ended up with such a selfish kappa. After all, He doesn't think about the future. Judge Pep was still lighting a new cigarette and replying to the capitalist Gale. Then we were surprised by the loud voice of the musician Krebeck, clutching the manuscript of his poem. Krebeck called out to no one in particular, "That's it. We'll write a wonderful funeral song." Krebeck's narrow eyes lit up. He shook Mag's hand and suddenly flew to the door. Of course, by this time many of the Kappas from the neighborhood had gathered at the door of Doc's house, peering curiously into the house. But Krebeck pushed the Kappas aside, left and right, and then swiftly jumped into his car. At the same time, the car made a loud noise and quickly drove off somewhere. Hey, don't look like that. After Judge Pep pushed the many Kappas out of Doc's house in place of the policeman, he closed the door to Doc's house. Perhaps because of this, the room suddenly became quiet. In this silence, the smell of Doc's blood mixed with the scent of alpine flowers. We discussed how to clean up afterwards, but only Mag, the philosopher, was staring at Doc's corpse, thinking absent-mindedly about something. I tapped Mag on the shoulder and asked, "What are you thinking about?" "The life of a Kappa, you see." "What about the life of a Kappa? After all, for us Kappas to live the life of a Kappa properly," Mag added in a low voice, a little embarrassed. "In any case, we have to believe in the power of something other than us Kappas." It was these words of Mag that reminded me of religion. Of course, being a materialist, I have certainly never seriously considered religion. However, at the time I had been deeply moved by Doc's death and began to wonder what on earth the Kappa's religion might be. I immediately asked the student lab about this question. There are Christianity, Buddhism, Mohammedanism, Zoroastrianism, and others. The most influential is undoubtedly modernism. It is also called the life religion. The translation, life religion, may not be accurate. The original word is Kwimucha. Cha is probably the British word for ism. The translation of the original form of Kwimu, Kwimul, does not simply mean to live, but to eat, drink, and have intercourse. So there are churches and temples in this country, right? Don't make jokes. The great modern churches are the greatest buildings in this country. How about going to see them? One lukewarm, cloudy afternoon, Rapp went out to this great church with me with a sense of pride. Indeed, it is a building 10 times larger than Nicholas Cathedral. Not only that, but it is a great structure that combines all kinds of architectural styles. When I stood in front of this great temple, and looked at the high towers and round roofs, I felt something eerie. In fact, they looked like countless tentacles stretching up to the sky. We stood in front of the entrance. How small we were compared to that entrance, and looked up at this great temple, which was more like an enormous monster than this architecture. The interior of the temple was also vast. Many worshippers were walking among the Corinthian columns, but they looked very small, just like us. Soon we came across a kappa with a bent back. Rap bowed slightly to the kappa and spoke to him politely and respectfully. "Elder, you are in good health." The other kappa also bowed to him and replied politely, "Is this Mr. Rap? You're still the same," he started to say, but then stopped for a moment. Probably because he finally noticed that Rap's beak was rotten. "Ah, you seem to be in good health. But why are you here again today?" "Today, I've been accompanied by these people. As you probably know, they are." Then Rap talked at length about me. It seemed that this was also an excuse for why he rarely came to this great temple. "In that case, I would like to ask you to show this person around." The elder smiled broadly and first greeted me, then quietly pointed to the altar in front. "I can't be of any help in showing you around. We believers worship the tree of life, which stands on the altar in front. As you can see, the tree of life has gold and green fruit. The gold fruit is called the fruit of good, and the green fruit is called the fruit of evil." I was beginning to feel bored with this explanation. This was because the elder's words sounded like an old metaphor. Of course, I pretended to listen attentively. However, I couldn't help but glance stealthily into the interior of the cathedral from time to time. The Corinthian columns, Gothic vaulting, Arabian checkered floor, and Secession-style prayer desk, the harmony created by these elements had a strangely barbaric beauty. But what caught my eye most of all were the marble busts in the niches on either side. I felt like I had seen these figures before. That is no wonder. After the hunchbacked Kappa finished explaining about the tree of life, he walked over to the niche on the right with me and Lep, and began to explain the bust in the niche. "This is one of our saints, Strindberg, who rebelled against everything. It is said that this saint was saved because of Swedenborg's philosophy after suffering so much, but in fact he was not saved. This saint simply believed in the doctrine of life like us, or rather, he had no choice but to believe." Read the book called Legends that this saint left for us. This saint himself confesses that he was also a suicide attempter. Feeling a little depressed, I looked to the next niche. The bust in the next niche was of a German with a thick mustache and beard. This is Zarathustra's Portneitschi. This saint sought salvation from a Superman he himself created, but he was not saved and went mad. If he had not gone mad, perhaps he would not have been included in the number of saints. After a moment of silence, the elder led me to the third niche. The third one is Tolstoy. This saint practiced more penance than anyone else. This was because he was originally an aristocrat and hated to show his suffering to the curious public. This saint tried to believe in Christ, who was virtually unbelievable. In fact, he even publicly declared that he did. However, in his later years, he finally could not bear the fact that he was a tragic liar. It is well known that this saint was sometimes frightened by the beams in his study. However, he is included in the number of saints, so, of course, he did not commit suicide. The bust in the fourth niche is one of us Japanese. When I saw this Japanese man's face, I felt a sense of nostalgia. This is Kunikeda Dapo, a poet who clearly understood the feelings of the people killed by carnage. But I'm sure you don't need any further explanation. Now, please look inside the fifth niche. Isn't this Widener? Yes. A revolutionary who was a friend of the king. In his later years, the Saint Widener even prayed before meals. But of course, he was more of a follower of the Church of Life than Christianity, according to the letters Widener left behind. We don't know how many times the suffering of the world drove this saint to his death. By that time, we were standing in front of the sixth niche. This is a friend of Saint Strindberg, a French painter turned businessman who married a woman of 13 or 14 queens. Instead of his wife with many children, this saint had sailor's blood flowing through his large veins. But look at his lips. There are traces of arsenic or something. In the seventh niche, you must be tired now. Please come in. I was actually tired, so I followed the elder along with Lap, and we entered a room along the incense-smelling corridor. In the corner of this small room, there was a bunch of wild grapes offered under a black statue of Venus. I had imagined a plain monastery, so this was a bit surprising. The elder seemed to sense this sentiment from my appearance, and before offering us a chair, he explained with a pitying look on his face, "Please remember that this is the life teaching of our religion, the teaching of our God. The tree of life is to live vigorously." Mr. Rapp, have you shown this man our Bible? No, the truth is, I've hardly ever read it myself, Rapp answered honestly, scratching his head. But the elder continued speaking, still smiling quietly. Then you will not understand. Our God created this world in one day, even though the tree of life is a tree. It is not impossible to create it. And he also created a female kappa. The female kappa became bored and asked for a male kappa. Our God took pity on her plea and took the brain of the female kappa and created a male kappa. Our God blessed the two kappas, saying, "Eat, mate, and live vigorously." The elder's words reminded me of the poet Tok. The poet Tok is unfortunately an atheist like me. I am not a kappa. So it is no wonder that I did not know about the teachings of the life religion. But Tok, who was born in the land of kappas, would have known about the tree of life. I felt sorry for Tok's end, as he did not follow this teaching. So I interrupted the elder and started talking about To. Oh, that poor poet. The elder took a deep breath as he listened to what I said. Our fate is determined only by faith, circumstance, and chance, though you may also count heredity as a factor. Unfortunately, Tok had no faith. Tok would have envied you. I envy you too. Rap was young, and I might have been optimistic if only my beak had been in good condition. When the elder heard us say this, he took another deep breath. His eyes were still tearful as he stared at the black Venus. Actually, I too, this is my secret. So please don't tell anyone. I can't believe in our God either. But one day I will pray. Just as the elder said this, the door to the room suddenly opened, and a large female kappa jumped on the elder. Of course, we tried to hold her, but in a flash, she threw him down on the floor. You old man, you stole a lot of money from my wallet again today. After about 10 minutes, we left the elder and his wife behind so as not to run away, and went down the entrance to the great temple. I guess the elder doesn't believe in the tree of life either. After walking in silence for a while, Rap told me, but rather than reply, I instinctively looked back at the great temple. The great temple, with its tall towers and round roofs stretching out like countless tentacles into the overcast sky, still exuded the eerie feeling of a marriage scene in the desert sky. About a week later, I happened to hear a strange story from Chuck, the doctor. It turns out that a ghost appears in Tak's house. By that time, the female kappa had already moved away, and our poet friend's house had been turned into a photographer's studio. According to Chuck, when taking pictures in the studio, Tak's figure always appears hazy and blurry behind the customer. However, Chuck is a materialist, so he doesn't believe in life after death. In fact, when I told him the story, he smiled maliciously and added something like an annotation like, "I guess souls are materialistic after all. I'm not much different from Chuck in that I don't believe in ghosts." However, I felt a sense of familiarity with the poet Tok, so I rushed to the bookstore and bought newspapers and magazines that had articles about Tok's ghost and photos of Tok's ghost. Indeed, when I looked at the photos, I saw a kappa that looked somewhat like Tok, looming vaguely behind kappa of all ages, men, women, and children. But what surprised me more than the photo of Tok's ghost was the articles about Tok's ghost, particularly the report of the Psychiatric Society about Tok's ghost. I have translated the report quite word for word, so I will list the gist below. However, the notes in parentheses are my own additions. A report on the ghost of the poet Tok, published in the Psychiatric Society magazine. No, the Psychiatric Society held an emergency investigation meeting at 251 Street, the former home of the poet Tok, who recently committed suicide, and now the studio of photographer XX. The members who attended were as follows. Names omitted: 17 of us, along with the president of the Psychiatric Society, Mr. Peck, gathered in a room of the studio at 10:30 on September 17th, accompanied by our most trusted medium, Mrs. As soon as Mrs. Hoff entered the studio, she felt the spiritual atmosphere, and while her whole body went into convulsions, she tried to vomit several times. According to her, this was because the poet Mr. Tok loved tobacco so much that the spiritual atmosphere also contained nicotine. We, the members, sat silently around the round table with Mrs. After 3 minutes and 25 seconds, Mrs. Hoff suddenly fell into a sleepwalking state and was possessed by the spirit of the poet Mrs. In order of age, we members began the following dialogue with the spirit of Mrs. Tok, who had possessed Mrs. Why do you appear to ghosts? Answer: to find out about posthumous fame. Question: do you, or you spirits, desire fame even after death? Answer: at least I do not. However, one Japanese poet I met despised posthumous fame. Question: do you know the poet's name? Answer: unfortunately, I have forgotten. I only remember one chapter of a 17-character poem that he liked to write. What do you think of the poem? An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of the water. Do you think the poem is a good one? I don't necessarily think it's a bad one. However, Perhaps we should change frog to water frog and make it more colorful. If so, what is the reason for that? We water frogs are keen to find the essence of water frogs in any art. At that time, Chairman Peck warned our 17 members that this was a special investigation meeting of the Society for Psychical Research, not a joint review meeting. How are your lives, spiritualists? Are no different from yours. So do you regret committing suicide? Not necessarily. If I ever tire of my spiritual life, I will take up a pistol and support myself. Question: is it easy to support myself? Talk's spirit answers this question with another question. This should be a perfectly natural exchange for those who know talk. Answer: is it easy to commit suicide? Question: are your lives eternal? Answer: there are many conflicting theories about our lives, and we should not believe them. Fortunately, we should not forget that there are many religions among us, such as Christianity, Buddhism, Mohammedanism, and Zoroastrianism. Question: what do you yourself believe? Answer: I have always been a skeptic. Question: but shouldn't you at least doubt the existence of spirits? Answer: I am not as convinced as you are. How many friends do you have? My friends are from all over the world, past and present, and number at least 300 people. Some of the more famous ones include Kleist, Mainrendel, and Weininger. Do you only have friends who have committed suicide? Not necessarily. Someone like Montaigne, who defended suicide, is one of my most valued friends. However, I don't associate with pessimists who didn't commit suicide, like Schopenhauer. Is Schopenhauer still alive? He is currently establishing a spiritual pessimism and debating whether or not he can support himself. However, he seems to be extremely relieved to learn that cholera was also a fungal disease. We, the members, have successively asked questions about the spiritual news of Napoleon, Confucius, Dostoevsky, Darwin, Cleopatra, Shakyamuni, Demosthenes, Dante, Senno-Reikyu, and others. Unfortunately, however, Mr. Talk was unable to give a detailed answer and instead asked various gossip questions about himself. What will your reputation be like after your death? One critic called you one of the many minor poets. He must be one of those who holds a grudge, because I did not send him a collection of poems. Has my complete works been published? Your complete works have been published, but they seem to have sold very poorly. My complete works will be available for purchase by everyone after 300 years, that is, after the copyright has been lost. What about my female friend with whom I live? Answer: she is the wife of Mr. Luck, who owns a bookstore. Question: unfortunately, she is still unaware that Luck has an artificial eye. What about my child? Answer: I hear he is in a national orphanage. Tuck was silent for a while, then began a new question. Question: what about my house? Answer: it is a certain photographer's studio. Question: what about my desk? Answer: no one knows what it is like. Question: I have a bundle of letters that I keep secret in a drawer in my desk. But fortunately, this is not of concern to you busy folks. Now my spiritual world is slowly sinking into twilight. I must bid farewell to you all. Farewell, folks. Farewell, my good gentlemen. Off suddenly woke up again with these last words. We, the 17 members, swear to God above that this conversation is true. Furthermore, we have paid our trusted Mrs. off her wages according to the daily rate she received when she was an actress. After reading these articles, I gradually began to feel depressed about being in this country, so I wanted to return to our land of humans. However, no matter how much I searched, I could not find the hole I had fallen into. Then, in the story of the fisherman, Kappa called Bag, it was said that on the outskirts of the town in this country, an old Kappa lived a quiet life, reading books and playing the flute. I thought that if I asked this Kappa, perhaps he would be able to tell me a way to escape from this country, so I immediately went to the outskirts of the town. However, when I got there, I found not only an old Kappa, but a Kappa barely tall enough to hold his head in place, playing the flute leisurely in a very small house. Of course, I thought that I had entered the wrong house. However, just to be sure, I asked his name, and it turned out that it was the old Kappa that Bag had told me about. But you seem like a child, don't you know yet? What was my fate? When I came out of my mother's womb, I had a head of white hair. Then I gradually grew younger, and now I've become this child. But if you count my age, even if I was 60 before I was born, I might be 115 or 16 now. I looked around the room. Was it just my imagination? But there seemed to be a pure happiness floating about among the simple chairs and tables. You seem to be living a happier life than other Kappas, don't you? Well, that may be true. When I was young, I was older. And when I'm older, I'm younger. Therefore, I don't crave desires like older people, and I don't get carried away with sex like younger people. Anyway, Even if my life wasn't happy, it must have been peaceful. I see, that would be peaceful. No, that alone doesn't make it peaceful. I was physically healthy and had enough money to live comfortably. But I think the happiest thing about me was that I was born older. I talked to this Kappa for a while about Toku, who committed suicide, and Jill, who was being examined by a doctor every day. But for some reason, the older Kappa didn't seem very interested in what I was saying. So, unlike other Kappas, you don't have any particular attachment to life, do you? The old Kappa looked at me and quietly replied, I left my mother's womb after my father asked me if I would be born into this country like other Kappas. But I ended up falling into this country by accident. Please tell me the way to leave this country. There is only one way to leave. What do you mean? It's the way you came here. When I heard this answer, I felt a chill run down my spine for some reason. Unfortunately, I can't find that way. The old Kappa looked at me with his fresh eyes. Then he finally got up, walked to a corner of the room, and pulled a rope that was hanging from the ceiling. Then a skylight that I hadn't noticed before opened outside the round skylight. The blue sky is clearer beyond the spreading branches of pines and cypress trees. The peak of it, Ryunosuke, resembling a large arrowhead, also stands tall. I practically jumped for joy like a child seeing an airplane. Now, go out from there. The old Kappa said this, pointing to the rope from before. What I had thought was my rope was actually a rope ladder. Then I'll go out from there. But I'll tell you in advance, don't regret going out. Don't worry, it's okay. I won't regret anything. As soon as I replied, I was already climbing up the rope ladder, looking down at the plate on the old Kappa's head. After I came back from the land of the Kappa, I was put off for a while by the smell of our skin. Compared to us humans, Kappa are very clean. Not only that, but our human heads looked really creepy to me, who had only seen Kappa. You may not understand this, but aside from the eyes and mouth, this nose is strangely frightening. Of course, I made a plan to avoid meeting anyone as much as possible, but I gradually got used to us humans, and after about half a year, I was going out everywhere. The only problem I had was that I would accidentally say something from the land of the Kappa while talking. Are you at home tomorrow? Qua? What? Well, I'm here. It was something like that. However, exactly 1 year after I returned from Kappa country, a business venture failed. And when he said this, Doctor, warned him, "Stop talking about that." According to the doctor, whenever he talked about this, he became so violent that even the nurses couldn't handle it. Well, let's not talk about that. However, a business venture failed, and I remembered that I wanted to go back to Kappa country again. That's right, I didn't want to go. I remembered that I wanted to return. Kappa country felt like my hometown to me at the time. I quietly slipped out of the house and tried to catch a train on the Chuo line. Unfortunately, I was caught by a police officer and ended up being taken to the hospital. As I entered the hospital, I continued to think about Kappa country. I wonder how Chuck, the doctor, is doing. Mag, the philosopher, may still be thinking of something beneath the rainbow of glass lanterns. Especially my best friend, the Ruttenbeaked student rap, was light today on a cloudy afternoon. Lost in such memories, I tried to speak out involuntarily. Before I knew it, a Kappa fisherman named Ba had come in front of me, bowing his head repeatedly. After I had gathered my composure, I don't remember if I cried or laughed, but I do remember that I was moved to use the language of the Kappa country for the first time in a long time. "Hey, Bag, why did you come?" "Yes, I came to visit you. Apparently, you're sick." "How do you know that?" "I heard about it on the radio." Bag was smiling proudly. "Even so, you came here a lot, didn't you?" "No, there's nothing to see. The rivers and canals of Tokyo are just as common for Kappas to travel through. I realized only recently that Kappas are amphibious animals, just like frogs. But there are no rivers around here." "No, it came up here through the iron pipes of the water supply. Then we opened the fire hydrant." "Open the fire hydrant? Have you forgotten, sir? There are mechanics among Kappas too." After that, I was visited by various Kappas every 2 or 3 days, according to Dr. My illness is dementia praecox, but that doctor, Chuck, I'm sure this is very rude of you as well, said that I'm not a dementia praecox patient, and that the patients with dementia praecox are and you yourself. Even the Dr. Chuck comes, so of course the student rep and the philosopher Mag have come to visit. But apart from the fisherman Ryoshi's Bag, no one comes during the day, especially when 2 or 3 of them come together at night, especially when there is a moonlight. Last night, I spoke with Jill, the president of the glass company, and the philosopher Mag in the moonlight, and the musician Krebak also played a piece on the violin for me. Look, see that bouquet of black lilies on the desk over there? That was also a souvenir that Krebak brought last night. I looked back, but of course there was no booklet or anything on the desk. And this book was brought by the philosopher Mag. Try reading the first poem for a moment. No, you can't possibly know the language of the Kappa country, so let me read it instead. This is one of the recently published volumes of Talk's collected works. He opens an old telephone book and begins to read aloud this poem. Bata has long since slept among the palm blossoms and bamboo. It seems that Trist has already died, along with the withered figs by the roadside. But we must rest, even in front of the backdrop of a play. If you look behind that backdrop, you'll see nothing but patched canvases. But I'm not as pessimistic as this poet. As long as the Kappas come by from time to time. I'd forgotten about this. You remember my friend, Judge Pep? That Kappa really went mad after he lost his job. Apparently, he is currently in a psychiatric hospital in Kappa Country. I would like to visit Dr. if he would only agree. February 11, 1927.